You are the king's personal physician in the royal palace of Madrid, and the year is 1834. Ferdinand VII is already dead, but your work is not. You are led through dim corridors, past weeping servants and rigid guards, until you stand before the heavily guarded private chamber of the most hated man in Spain. Inside, Queen Regent Maria Cristina, eyes red with grief and something darker, fixes you with a desperate stare and quietly gives you an order that makes your stomach turn. The king's soul has gone to face judgment, but his body, or rather one infamous part of it, must be preserved, not for love, not for honor, but because this monstrous piece of flesh has come to symbolize an entire reign twisted by inbreeding, paranoia, sexual cruelty, and political catastrophe. As you pull back the silk sheets, you understand why courtiers whispered behind fans, why foreign ambassadors joked in private letters, and why 3 queens left this world broken in mind and body. The mystery of Ferdinand VII is lying right in front of you, grotesque, deformed, and far too large to belong to a man whose spirit was so small. And as you begin the preservation, you realize you aren't just embalming a body part. You're embalming the physical symbol of a kingdom destroyed by one man's private nightmare. To understand how Ferdinand VII became the most perverted king in history, you have to start long before his birth, inside the poisoned tree of Europe's royal bloodlines. For centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs, and then the Bourbons, had treated the royal family like a closed loop. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, alliances were sealed not just between nations, but inside the same tangled family. Every generation tightened the genetic noose a little more. Mental instability, strange faces, weak jaws, barren wombs. These were the quiet costs of dynastic purity. Ferdinand was born at El Escorial on October 14, 1784, the unfortunate son of King Charles IV of Spain and Maria Luisa of Parma, who were themselves close relatives. From the outside, he looked like a typical Bourbon prince, heavy features, brooding eyes, a boy destined for power. But hidden beneath his aristocratic clothes, nature had drawn a cruel caricature. As he grew from child to adolescent, the royal doctors noticed something they had no language for, no precedent, no polite way to record. Ferdinand's genitals were not merely large, they were monstrously disproportionate, misshapen in ways that defied medical logic. In secret notes, tucked away in church and palace archives, physicians described an organ of extraordinary length and bizarre form, such as to make normal intimacy doubtful. Another, less diplomatic, compared it to a staff or club, narrow at the root, bulging grotesquely at the end, twisting in a way that made it both frightening and functionally useless. Whatever the exact measurements, the conclusion was clear: this was not a blessing. It was a mechanical and psychological curse. The impact on young Ferdinand was devastating. In an age obsessed with classical ideals, where the refined male body was supposed to be balanced, moderate, civilized, his deformity marked him as an aberration. Rumors began early. Servants saw things they shouldn't have seen, valets talked to kitchen maids, and foreign diplomats' spies did what they were paid to do: observe and report. The prince's most private shame slowly became Europe's darkest running joke. Ferdinand felt it. He heard the half-swallowed laughter behind closed doors, saw the sideways glances, sensed the awkward silences when his name came up in conversations about succession and marriage. His parents' marriage was already a theater of humiliation. Charles IV was weak and distracted, more interested in hunting than ruling, while Maria Luisa openly paraded her favorite, Manuel Godoy, as the real power in Spain. The young prince grew up in a court where betrayal and ridicule were everyday currency. Combine that environment with a body that made him feel like a freak, and you get the core of Ferdinand's character: a man convinced that the world was laughing at him, that everyone around him was either mocking, using, or plotting against him. Servants who accidentally walked in on him changing didn't just lose their jobs. Some were flogged, exiled, or made to disappear altogether. A single glimpse at the king's secret could cost you your life. Shame hardened into cruelty. Insecurity fermented into paranoia. By the time Ferdinand reached adolescence, his tutors were already sounding alarms, quietly, carefully. They noted his vindictiveness, his tendency to lash out against the powerless, his obsession with secrecy, and his growing delight in watching others squirm under his authority. The more humiliated he felt inside, the more he compensated by cruel displays of power on the outside. He began seeing insults where none were intended, conspiracies in every corner, and hidden mockery in every polite bow. This was the man who would inherit a crumbling empire. A king shaped not only by inbreeding and bad parenting, but by an anatomical curse that he interpreted as the world's insult to him personally. A man who would go on to turn his own bedroom into a torture chamber, his marriages into nightmares, and his country into the stage for his unresolved, festering rage. The tragedy of Spain in the early 19th century is that millions of people's lives were about to be shaped by one man's warped relationship with his own body. In 1802, the Spanish court dressed itself in gold and silk. Bells rang, cannons fired, and crowds shouted themselves hoarse. The young heir to the Spanish throne, Ferdinand, was to marry his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. On paper, it was a perfect dynastic match, Bourbon to Bourbon, Catholic to Catholic. Two branches of the same twisted family tree tying one more knot. Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid full of romantic illusions. She had heard supporters call Ferdinand el Deseado, the desired one, and imagined a brooding but noble prince who would sweep her into a storybook life. She had no idea what waited behind the walls of the royal bedchamber. The warning signs came in whispers. In the days before the wedding night, Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies, in waiting with a list of special requirements for the marital chamber. Strange cushions were ordered, bolsters of peculiar shape, bottles of oils and salves, devices that looked more like medical instruments than anything associated with love. The ladies were told it was customary in Spain. It was not. It was custom only for this groom. When Ferdinand finally appeared in the bridal chamber, whatever romantic fantasies Maria Antonia had nurtured shattered in an instant. One lady-in-waiting later wrote that the young queen reacted as though she had seen a demon. She screamed, backed against the wall, and called her new husband a monster. The thing Ferdinand had spent his entire life hiding had just been exposed to the one person he needed most to accept it. And her honest, terrified reaction cut him to the core. What followed was not a wedding night. It was a procedure. Court physicians, already pre-briefed on the special situation, were called in to explain what would be required of the queen, how the cushions and supports had been designed to make the act possible while trying to avoid serious injury. Maria Antonia, raised in modesty and religious fear, had never even been told the basics of intimacy. Now she was being prepped for an ordeal that sounded more like surgery than consummation. Under the influence of laudanum to dull her terror and pain, she submitted. The king's grotesquely malformed organ had to be propped, angled, supported. The whole process was clumsy, brutal, and emotionally annihilating for both of them. The physician's private letters describe Ferdinand's need for a special pillow to prevent damage to himself, and the queen's body struggling to endure something for which the human anatomy simply wasn't designed. The psychological scars were immediate and deep. Ferdinand saw raw horror in his bride's eyes, and registered it not as pity or shock, but as betrayal and insult. His shame calcified into rage. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, began a slow-motion collapse into trauma. To face her marital duties, she increasingly relied on laudanum, sinking into addiction just to numb herself enough to survive nights with her husband. Months turned into years. The royal couple's attempts to produce an heir became a horror ritual. Doctors preparing the room, devices arranged, cushions placed, narcotics administered. Ferdinand forcing his body and his will upon a woman who flinched at the mere sound of his footsteps. Twice she became pregnant. Twice the pregnancies ended in tragedy. One early miscarriage, one late near-term catastrophe that nearly killed her and forever broke what was left of her health. For Ferdinand, those losses were never about a woman nearly dying in agony. They were about him being denied an heir yet again. Rather than comforting his wife, he fixated on the idea that she was somehow sabotaging the pregnancies, that her repulsion, her weakness, her supposed liberal sympathies were offending God. Whispered accusations spread, that she took secret herbs to prevent conception, that she moved in ways that shook the seed loose, that she did not truly want to bear his child. Already fragile, Maria Antonia internalized this cruelty. She began to believe she might indeed be cursed. She prayed obsessively, begged forgiveness for unnamed sins, and became a ghost drifting through the palace, hollow-eyed, addicted, and broken. In 1807, at just 21, she died. The official cause: fever, delicate constitution. The unofficial truth: years of physical trauma, drug dependence, and relentless psychological abuse had finally finished what Ferdinand's bedroom had started. Even after her death, the darkness didn't end. Rumors spread that Ferdinand had played a role, that the palace apothecary who died suddenly and mysteriously days later knew too much about what had been given to the queen. A letter he supposedly wrote vanished into Ferdinand's private archives, never to be seen again. Maria Antonia was the first of 3 wives to be broken on the wheel of Ferdinand's deformity and paranoia, and her death did not humble him. It hardened him. In his mind, she had failed him. She was another tool that refused to work, another body that would not obey the king's will. Spain had no heir. Ferdinand had no empathy, and the story was just getting started. As Ferdinand's personal life crumbled, his political world went up in flames. By 1807, he was already at the center of conspiracies against his own father, Charles IV, and the hated minister Manuel Godoy. Nobles and soldiers, calling themselves the Fernandinos, saw in him a convenient figurehead to topple the weak king and his favorite. They imagined a savior. What they actually backed was a man whose private demons would prove more destructive than the incompetence they wanted to overthrow. The so-called El Escorial conspiracy exposed Ferdinand's true nature. When the plot was discovered, he didn't stand by his allies. He instantly betrayed them, revealing names, details, and correspondence in a desperate attempt to save himself. The man who would later be called Spain's desired one was already a master at throwing others under the carriage to protect his own brittle ego. Then came Napoleon. In 1808, Spain was drawn into the French emperor's vast Game of Thrones. Ferdinand briefly became king, then quickly lost everything. Napoleon lured him to Bayonne, forced him to abdicate, and shipped him off to comfortable captivity at the Château of Valenciennes. For 6 years, while his country bled and burned in the Peninsular War, Ferdinand lived as a royal prisoner, pampered and watched. French intelligence, meticulous and ruthless, knew all about his mystery. Their doctors examined him under the guise of medical care and recorded what Spanish physicians had only whispered. In cold clinical language, they described an organ so large, so misshapen, that it bordered on the mythological. They debated rare disorders, hormonal imbalances, and the cumulative effects of centuries of inbreeding. For them, Ferdinand was more laboratory specimen than king, a living example of what happens when power and bloodlines loop too tightly for too long. While guerrillas and regular armies fought and died in Spain, Ferdinand's main obsession in captivity was not strategy, not patriotism, not reform. It was his ongoing sexual problem and his desperate desire for an heir. He wrote letters across Europe seeking potential brides who might accept his special circumstances. He was not thinking about the peasants starving under occupation or the cities destroyed by war. He was thinking about his bedroom. When he finally returned to Spain in 1814, the welcome was hysterical. Crowds cried, kissed the ground, and hailed him as the savior who would restore order after French humiliation. Children were held up to see him, women threw flowers, men shouted blessings. But the Ferdinand who rode through Madrid streets that day was not a wise reformer. He was the same traumatized, paranoid, sexually tormented man, now gifted absolute power and a traumatized kingdom to play with. His first act was not to reward those who had fought for him, nor to draft a new and healing vision for Spain. It was to crush the liberal constitution that had been written in his absence and restore absolute monarchy. His second priority was even more revealing. He ordered the creation of a new arsenal of marital aids, crafted by the finest artisans from Spain, Italy, Germany, even the Ottoman Empire cushions, supports, harnesses, and devices designed to make his anatomy usable while minimizing the damage it inflicted. With this grim toolkit assembled, Ferdinand married again. In 1816, he took as his second wife Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin. She arrived young, hopeful, and as tragically unprepared as Maria Antonia had been. Despite careful briefings to her entourage, nothing could prepare her for the reality. The wedding was a baroque spectacle of music, incense, and ritual. The wedding night was a scream. The palace staff later spoke of blood-stained sheets, overturned furniture, and a queen who emerged from the experience ruined in spirit. Doctors tried new arrangements of cushions, other angles, more oils, different positions. Ferdinand, increasingly desperate, even allowed foreign anatomists and physicians to observe their attempts under the pretext of scientific study. The royal bed became a stage for medical voyeurism. Maria Isabel's mind began to fragment. She developed a stutter, flinched at sudden sounds, and woke from nightmares crying about a monster in her room. Palace doctors labeled her episodes hysteria. Today, we'd call it what it was: severe, repeated trauma. Her husband took her terror not as proof of the hell he was forcing on her, but as yet another personal insult, another sign that the world was conspiring to mock him. Outside the palace walls, the consequences were national. Spain's American colonies, already restless and in revolt, saw in Ferdinand an emblem of divine disfavor. A king physically incapable of producing healthy heirs, ruling a kingdom collapsing under his misrule. Pamphlets and rumors painted him as a sexually twisted tyrant whose impotence mirrored his political incompetence. As Mexico, Argentina, and others broke away, Ferdinand responded not with reforms, but with purges, censorship, and the holy machinery of the Inquisition. In 1818, Maria Isabel's torment ended the only way royal women of her position could truly escape. She died, officially of nervous exhaustion, unofficially of a broken mind and body. Ferdinand did not look inward, he looked outward for enemies. He demanded autopsies, ordered investigations for imagined poisons, and arrested members of her household. The second queen was gone. The king's paranoia and sexual frustration remained, sharpening into something even darker. 2 wives dead, no heir, an empire shattering, a court suffocating under fear. And Ferdinand, instead of learning from any of it, doubled down on superstition, on cruelty, and on his obsession with forcing a cursed body to produce the heir he believed the universe owed him. By the time Ferdinand arranged his third marriage, his reputation across Europe was toxic. Princesses whispered nervously when his name came up. Families quietly pulled their daughters from consideration. What had once been private gossip about his bedroom was now an open diplomatic problem. Who would dare marry a king whose previous wives had died young, and whose difficulties were now infamous? The answer came from Saxony. Maria Josefa Amalia, a pious and serious princess from a financially strained house, agreed to the match in 1819. She arrived older than Ferdinand's previous brides, and far better prepared. Her physicians had spoken with Spanish doctors. She knew she was not walking into a fairy tale. She brought her own doctor, her own treatments, her own religious resolve. She approached the marriage like a grim assignment rather than a romance. Their married life was scheduled like a clinical trial. Attempts at intimacy were carefully planned, dates marked, positions decided in advance, cushions arranged, devices ready. Maria Josefa kept notes, timings, methods, outcomes, like a researcher tracking variables in an experiment. It was cold, mechanical, and utterly devoid of tenderness. And yet, compared to the sheer panic of the previous queens, her stoic detachment allowed her to endure longer. For Ferdinand, however, her composure was infuriating. He felt reduced to a case study, a specimen under observation, even in bed. His paranoia twisted this clinical approach into a new conspiracy theory. Perhaps the Saxon doctors were collecting data to mock him in foreign courts. Perhaps Maria Josefa was secretly sending reports that would become medical gossip in Vienna or Paris. He ordered her correspondence monitored. He had her personal physician watched. The bedroom became not only a theater of struggle, but a battlefield of espionage in his mind. Meanwhile, Spain continued to disintegrate. Independence movements in the Americas, economic collapse at home, uprisings, coups, and counter-coups. Ferdinand responded to all of it with the same mixture of repression and denial. Cabinet meetings were postponed or cancelled entirely if he was in one of his obsessive phases about conception. Ministers waited outside his door while he discussed lubricants and prayer schedules with doctors and confessors. The fate of millions literally hung on whether the king was in a good mood about his latest attempt. Then, against all odds, it happened. In 1829, after a decade of humiliations, Maria Josefa became pregnant. The news dropped on Madrid like a thunderclap. Bells rang, church choirs sang Te Deums, foreign ambassadors sent astonished reports home. Was it a miracle, a medical breakthrough, or a fluke courtesy of one carefully engineered excruciating night? For Ferdinand it was validation. At last, proof, he thought, that his body could cooperate. His paranoia flipped into overdrive. He brought in more guards, more priests, more physicians. Maria Josepha's chambers were turned into a high-security shrine. Her diet, sleep, movements, and visitors were controlled to an insane degree. The king saw enemies everywhere, in kitchen staff, confessors, even in shadows on the wall. Complications began in the 7th month. Modern medicine would call it a serious obstetric crisis. In the chaos of that time, it became a battlefield between science and superstition. Doctors argued, priests blessed, mystics muttered, and Ferdinand overruled everyone, insisting on his own blend of remedies and rituals. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The scene that followed was pure horror cries, blood, conflicting orders, the king himself presiding over a trauma he did not understand. A daughter was born, tiny and fragile, and lived only a few hours. Maria Josepha followed her to the grave 3 weeks later, likely from infection and sheer physical and emotional devastation. 2 deaths, 1 failed miracle, and a court plunged once more into mourning. Ferdinand refused burial for days, forcing physicians to attempt resuscitations on decomposing bodies in a grotesque denial of reality. The palace stank of death while Spain looked on in disgust and fear. Yet even this double tragedy did not end his obsession. If anything, it cracked his sanity further. He began to surround himself with death masks of his wives, their lifeless faces staring down from the walls of his chambers. The bed, the devices, the cushions, all of it remained as a shrine to his failure. And still, advisors insisted, Spain needed an heir. So they found an answer that wasn't really an answer at all: Maria Cristina of Naples. She became Ferdinand's 4th wife later in 1829, and there was a catch. She arrived in Madrid already pregnant. The timing made it biologically impossible for Ferdinand to be the father, and everyone with a basic sense of arithmetic knew it. But the king, desperate and broken, chose to believe, or at least chose to pretend to believe. A child would be declared his, whether the blood said so or not. In 1830, that child was born, Isabella, the future Isabella II of Spain. The long-awaited triumph of Ferdinand's obsession came not from his tortured body, but from a convenient lie. The most perverted king in history finally had his heir, and had never felt more humiliated, suspicious, or trapped. Isabella's birth should have closed the wound. Spain finally had a successor, the Bourbon line continued, and Ferdinand could, in theory, lay his torment to rest. Instead, it poured gasoline on his paranoia. The king knew, in some corner of his mind, that the child could not be his. He loved her as his political salvation, and hated her as proof of his own failure. That contradiction aided him day and night. His relationship with Maria Cristina turned into a theater of surveillance. He had peepholes cut into the walls between their rooms, spending hours watching her in secret, while she prayed, read, nursed the baby, or simply sat in silence. Guards changed constantly, so no one served long enough to build loyalty. Her letters were opened and copied. Her confessions were reported. Every look she gave another man, every whisper with her ladies, became in Ferdinand's mind a potential clue to the true father of Isabella. The queen, living under this unblinking gaze, slowly frayed. Her diary, later found hidden behind a false wall, described life as being always on stage, even when alone. She developed tremors, anxiety, and the hollow stare of someone who has learned that even her thoughts feel unsafe. The court adapted with its own survival strategies, speaking in half-sentences, avoiding direct opinions, drifting from room to room like ghosts wary of unseen eyes. Outside the palace, Spain was a mess. The empire was reduced, poor, and humiliated. Rebel movements simmered at home. Independence was already a reality abroad, and the great powers of Europe quietly wrote Spain off as a failing state under a deranged ruler. Diplomats' reports from this period read like dispatches from an asylum. A king obsessed with food tasters, seeing plots in flower arrangements, postponing vital meetings because of a bad mood or a new fear about poison. Ferdinand's health began to fail under the strain he himself created. Insomnia, digestive agony, Trembling hands and wild mood swings became routine. He ranted about invisible conspiracies, tested ministers by deliberately contradicting himself, and interpreted any correction as treason. He suspected his own brother Don Carlos, sparking a succession crisis that would haunt Spain after his death. When Maria Cristina tried to shield Isabella from his madness, he interpreted maternal protection as preparation for a coup. By the early 1830s, Ferdinand VII was a ruin, a man whose entire reign could be summed up as a war against his own body and shadow enemies he created in his head. In 1833, his body finally gave out. Officially, he died of gout and complications. Unofficially, he died of exhaustion on every level: physical, psychological, spiritual. A life spent fighting anatomy, wives, subjects, and phantoms had burned him out. And then came the final, morbid chapter, the autopsy. Behind sealed doors, the same physicians who had spent decades trying to solve, the king's problem now had one last chance to examine it without his rage hovering over them. What they found confirmed every rumor. Ferdinand's organ, preserved for study, measured an astonishing length and changed thickness dramatically from base to tip. Internally, there were scars, adhesions, and malformed tissues, the evidence of a lifetime of failed medical interventions and, more chillingly, crude self-surgery attempts. Somewhere in his youth, maybe in a moment of desperation and self-loathing, Ferdinand VII had tried to fix himself with his own hands and whatever tools he could steal or hide. Every failed attempt worsened his condition, turning an already severe deformity into a near-total functional disaster. Those scars told the truth. Behind the tyrant there had always been a terrified boy, hacking at his own flesh in the dark, trying to become normal. The preserved organ, the sketches, and the written observations were deemed too explosive to reveal. They were quietly sealed away, allegedly within church and state archives, whispered about by a handful of scholars as one of history's strangest state secrets. Not because they were obscene, but because they were too revealing. They explained far too much about how one man's shame could deform an entire country's fate. Ferdinand left behind a Spain fractured by civil war, impoverished, diplomatically isolated, and ruled by a child queen whose very legitimacy was questioned from day one. His reign proved something terrifying, that when a system concentrates absolute power in one broken person, private dysfunction becomes public catastrophe. His wives paid with their bodies and sanity. His subjects paid with their freedom, their prosperity, and, often, their lives. And what about his immortality? He got it, but not as a glorious king or saintly ruler. Ferdinand VII lives on in history as a cautionary tale. The most perverted king in history was not just perverted in the bedroom. His entire approach to power was twisted, driven by humiliation, resentment, and an obsession with controlling what he could never truly master: his own body, his own fears, and the people around him. As you, the royal physician in our opening scene, finish your macabre task of preservation, you realize you are not just handling flesh. You are holding a symbol, a grotesque monument to the cost of unchecked power and unhealed shame. A single deformed organ that, in a very real sense, deformed a kingdom. If you want more brutal, hidden stories like this, where history isn't polished, but shown with all its disturbing cracks, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which twisted ruler or forgotten scandal you want exposed next. We're piecing together the dark side of the past, one forbidden story at a time.